Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a really intricate topic today, pulling insights from the material you've shared, focusing on how Muslims in India have navigated their sense of belonging and national identity. It's quite a story.
It really is spanning centuries, actually.
Exactly, and revealing layers of perspective, far more complex than simple headlines might suggest.
That's absolutely right. Looking at the material, what immediately stands out is the depth and, well, the complexity of this history. It's really far from a straightforward narrative. Our goal here is to unpack the key moments, the figures, and the different ideas presented in these sources, sort of build a clearer picture of this multifaceted story. We need to look beyond easy assumptions, really dig into the nuances.
For sure, and we're talking about a huge population here. What is it? Around 200 million people,
Roughly, yeah, about 15% of India.
which makes it one of the largest Muslim communities globally. But as the material emphasizes, they are incredibly diverse internally.
Oh, definitely. Sunnis, Shias, different languages, different cultures,
Yeah.
even like lively local debates about traditions, they are absolutely not a monolith.
Even if they're often painted with that single brush, right?
Exactly. And that simplified perception can often trap them between, well, outdated stereotypes, sometimes seen only through the lens of past rulers,
Right, the Mughal legacy thing.
or other times viewed primarily as just a marginalized or monolithic group. The material we explored really challenges these easy boxes, showing the immense diversity of thought, action, and frankly, resilience within this community.
Okay, let's get into the flow of this history then. Understand where these different imaginations of nationalism in India began. We really have to start back in the colonial period, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. If we connect this to the broader arc, understanding this foundational period is crucial because the British Raj didn't just introduce new rulers, it fundamentally altered the political landscape.
Now so.
Well, it forced communities to rethink their place, their identity within this new structure.
Okay, so diving into the material on the British colonial era, it becomes clear this is where some of the fundamental questions about identity really started to bubble up. The material highlights the significant impact the decline, the eventual loss of power,
Yeah.
had on Muslim elites after the fall of the Mughal Empire.
You can imagine a tangible sense of displacement, like the world order was shifting beneath their feet.
Yeah, so this experience raises a vital question. How do you adapt? How do you find a new footing when the established structures you knew are just gone?
And the material introduces figures like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan during this time. He emerges as a pivotal character.
What was his approach?
He advocated strongly for Muslims to embrace modern education, Western education, and find ways to engage constructively with the British system.
Ah, the founder of Aligarh Muslim University.
That's the one. Back in 1875, it was a concrete step, essentially a call to understand and navigate the new realities of power and knowledge.
Yeah, but that path wasn't universally accepted among Muslims, was it? I mean, the sources mention pushback.
Oh, absolutely not. Some were deeply suspicious of aligning too closely with the colonial rulers, and at the same time, you see the Indian National Congress forming.
Pushing for self-rule, for independence.
Right. But the material points out that its composition, predominantly Hindu, sparked anxieties among some Muslims. They started asking, okay, what's our place going to be in a potentially independent Hindu-majority India?
Would the nation truly be for everyone? That uncertainty, it seems, was a really significant factor.
Precisely. This was a period where different ideas about what India was or what it should become were actively being shaped. For some Muslims, the vision was straightforward: a unified India, equal citizens.
But for others,
For others, maybe sensing that potential for marginalization, the idea of needing a distinct political identity within India, or even a separate political entity, started to gain momentum.
these were fundamentally different ways of imagining the future nation then.
Completely different. And that's the context in which the All India Muslim League gains prominence, eventually led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
And the material shows his evolution, right? He started in Congress.
He did, but later became the champion of that idea, the idea of a separate Muslim state. This wasn't just, political maneuvering. It represented a deep divergence in how the future of the subcontinent was envisioned.
And it's important to see this not as just a sudden thing, but
Exactly, a gradual process. Different political strategies, anxieties, all deeply influenced by that colonial context and the dynamics within the independence movement itself. These slowly solidified into these distinct, sometimes conflicting visions.
okay, fast forward to 1947. The British depart, and the result is partition. The material describes this just immense upheaval. Tragedy.
Devastating. India is divided, millions displaced, horrific violence.
And for Muslims who found themselves in the newly independent India, this was a moment of profound crisis, a stark choice.
The human dimension here, as presented in the material, is absolutely critical. It highlights the gut-wrenching decision countless families faced.
Stay in India or move to Pakistan.
Right. And the material makes clear that a significant number chose to stay. They placed their trust in the promise of secular India, a nation where all faiths could coexist. They chose to remain on the land that had been their home for generations.
And that promise was powerfully articulated by leaders like Nehru and Gandhi.
Especially Gandhi, yeah. He championed this vision of an inclusive India, where the equality of all faiths was paramount.
But the material notes the tragedy of his assassination by a Hindu nationalist shortly after partition.
A stark, painful reminder of how fragile that vision was and how fiercely it was opposed by some.
So for those who remained in India, the post-partition era, the Constitution guaranteed equal rights, secularism under Nehru.
It did on paper, but it presented a new set of challenges. The shadow of partition lingered.
How so?
The material discusses this unfair, persistent stereotype questioning their loyalty. Were they really Indian, or did their sympathies lie elsewhere with Pakistan?
Wow, that's a heavy burden to place on an entire community.
Absolutely, based on events and political choices made largely by elites.
So it sounds like the lived reality on the ground was complicated, even with those constitutional protections.
Very much so. The material points out that while the dominant narrative in the Nehruvian era celebrated aspects of Indian cultural heritage, it sometimes struggled to fully integrate the identities and contributions of the poor and marginalized.
Including many Muslims.
Including many Muslims, yes. Their history wasn't always seen through the lens of their everyday lives or their diverse contributions across various fields. Sometimes it got burdened by this focus on a distant royal past that just didn't resonate with their contemporary reality.
Right, it sort of overshadowed their present.
Exactly. This period, despite its secular foundation, showed how dominant historical and cultural narratives can unintentionally sideline certain groups. The material highlights how a simplified narrative around Muslims, either as former rulers or somehow responsible for partition, or just a burden, obscured the complex, diverse reality of Muslim life and their deep engagement with India.
Okay, moving into the later 20th century and into the 21st. The material indicates a pretty significant shift with the rise of Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva.
Yes, a major shift. This movement, strongly associated with political entities like the BJP and ideological groups like the RSS, brought forward a different imagination of India.
Different how?
One where the nation is conceptualized as fundamentally Hindu, positioning other religious communities in a potentially secondary or conditional space.
That feels like a fundamental challenge to that earlier vision of a pluralistic, secular India.
It absolutely is. The material tracks how the increasing political power of the BJP, particularly under Narendra Modi since 2014, has moved this perspective from the margins, really, to the center of the national discourse.
And the material gives specific examples of how this is manifested in policy, in public narrative.
Yes. The Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, in 2019 is presented as a key case study.
Explain that a bit.
Well, the material notes how critics argued this law appeared to create a pathway to citizenship for non-Muslim immigrants from neighboring countries while explicitly excluding Muslims. This raised significant concerns within the community about potential future marginalization.
And the protests it sparked.
Widespread protests, as described in the material, they really highlight the intensity of feelings surrounding this issue. It touched a raw nerve.
The historical narrative promoted by Hindutva, as discussed in the material, also seems like a major point of contention.
It is. It points out how history is sometimes selectively presented, often portraying medieval Muslim rulers negatively.
Using monuments and such as proof.
Exactly. Using historical monuments as symbols or proof of past dominance. This particular approach to history, according to the material, can fuel contemporary tensions and reinforce that idea that Muslims are somehow alien or a national burden.
Yeah, and the material stresses the importance of critically engaging with history here. It reminds us history is rarely simple, rarely one-sided.
Definitely. And interestingly, the material also notes a fascinating paradox that exists alongside this narrative. Many Hindus simultaneously hold respect for Islam and genuinely value India's religious diversity.
So it's not monolithic either way.
Not at all. It creates a complex, sometimes contradictory dynamic within society. It's a powerful reminder that societal attitudes are rarely uniform. Public opinion often contains conflicting viewpoints, adding another layer to the complex environment Muslims in India navigate daily.
So given all these complex political and social currents, how have Muslims themselves responded? The material provides a picture of, well, remarkable resilience and diverse responses.
Very diverse. It's very clear there isn't one single voice or strategy.
Who are some of the figures highlighted?
The material introduces us to individuals who actively shaped the conversation, pushed back against simplistic definitions. Figures like Hussein Dalwai, described as a reformist.
What did he advocate for?
He worked to articulate a modern Muslim identity deeply rooted in Indian values, positioning himself as a challenge to both, sort of, traditional conservative Muslim viewpoints and the rising tide of Hindu nationalism.
Interesting. And Syed Shahabuddin.
A diplomat, a politician. He dedicated himself to advocating for Muslim rights, addressing their concerns, but always, as the material emphasizes, working firmly within India's secular democratic framework.
So these examples, and others mentioned, show that for many Muslims in India, their religious identity and their Indian national identity, they aren't mutually exclusive.
Not at all. For many, the effort is about finding and asserting their rightful place within India's diverse fabric.
But they grappled with incredibly difficult questions.
Existential questions. How do you voice community concerns, assert your identity, without being automatically labeled anti-national? How do you engage with a state apparatus where perceived favoritism or bias is a reality for many?
It sounds like an ongoing negotiation.
A constant effort, the material shows, to secure rights and dignity within a challenging political landscape.
And we get a more granular view from specific regions, too, like Kerala.
Yes, the material includes insights there. Muslims make up about 27% of the population in Kerala. It describes them as engaged in lively internal debates. Polemics, as the research notes.
But these debates aren't necessarily about deep theology.
Often less about that, the material suggests, and more about practical matters. Social organization, identity assertion, the practicalities of survival and thriving as a significant minority within a democracy.
What's insightful there?
Well, based on the research presented, the idea is that these internal debates, even disagreements between groups, aren't necessarily just fragmentation. They can be a vibrant way for the community to define itself, engage with its identity, and actively claim public space for Islam within a secular political system. It's a form of agency, really.
That's a fascinating perspective. Another critical factor the material highlights is the significant role of media in shaping perceptions.
Huge factor. Particularly after events like 9/11, coverage in various outlets has sometimes, unfortunately, reinforced stereotypes, portraying Muslims through a lens of suspicion or as a potential security threat.
And that's powerful, isn't it? How the language in headlines or the framing of a story can unfairly influence public opinion.
Definitely. Sometimes casting an entire community as villains in a narrative they just don't recognize. And while the material suggests this isn't always, intentional bias.
That's all happens.
It happens. And social media.
Oh, boy.
Especially the rapid spread of viral forwards, unchecked information online. It amplifies myths and harmful stereotypes incredibly quickly.
However, the materials is also clear that Muslims aren't just passively receiving these narratives.
No, not at all. They are actively pushing back, utilizing blogs, online platforms, social media.
Telling their own stories.
Exactly. Sharing their experiences, working to reclaim their narrative from these external portrayals.
And that counter-effort seems vital in the current information environment.
Absolutely vital. Amplifying those authentic, diverse voices online helps provide a much-needed balance to the often simplified or skewed portrayal in some mainstream spaces.
So as we look ahead, where does this deep dive leave us in understanding this complex topic? The material suggests India's Muslims continue to navigate this intricate balance between faith, diverse identities, and their place within the nation.
Yeah, and the material seems to point to the biggest ongoing challenge being how to forge a sense of Indian nationalism that is truly inclusive, one that genuinely embraces all its citizens rather than being defined by a select group or a narrow definition of who belongs.
Does the material offer any pathways forward?
It offers some avenues for reflection. It discusses the importance of, say, rethinking education to ensure a shared history is taught, one that includes the contributions and experiences of all communities, not just focusing on conflict or one group's perspective.
That makes sense.
It also emphasizes amplifying diverse Muslim voices beyond stereotypes in mainstream platforms and the critical importance of fostering genuine dialogue, real understanding between different communities across the country.
It really sounds like the material is arguing that India's foundational strength is its diversity, but realizing the potential of that diversity requires ongoing commitment, ongoing work, not just aspirational language or, political slogans.
Exactly. The fundamental question isn't whether Muslims can be Indian. They have been for centuries, but rather whether India can fully live up to its constitutional promise of being a truly inclusive home for everyone.
It's about whether the nation's collective imagination can continue to evolve and expand.
To truly encompass the vibrant, complex reality of its entire population.
Yeah. Wow. That was quite a journey through centuries of history. From the colonial era through partition, navigating shifting political landscapes, and the ongoing efforts to find and assert belonging. It's abundantly clear that the story of Muslim imaginations of nationalism in India is incredibly rich, complex, and far from concluded.
Definitely not concluded. It reminds us that identity, especially in a place as diverse as India, is dynamic. It's often messy, always evolving.
Yeah. It reinforces that identity is rarely a simple binary, right? And belonging in a diverse nation involves continuous negotiation, multiple perspectives, constant adaptation.
And being Muslim and being Indian are not conflicting ideas, despite attempts by some to frame them that way. For millions, they are deeply intertwined.
Thinking about everything we've just explored, here's a thought maybe to consider as you, our listener, move through your day. If national identity is something that is continuously being imagined and reimagined, particularly in a nation as vast and diverse as India, what is your role in understanding, contributing to, or even challenging that collective imagination?
That's a great question, something to reflect on as you process the information we've discussed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the material you shared.